What would go through your mind if you saw a man in broad daylight, surrounded by people, openly pleasuring himself? Would you be shocked, confused, or angry? Well, one philosopher did just that. Let's start with one of the most infamous stories about Diogenes, the one where he was caught masturbating in public. Incident number 1. Masturbation in public, a radical lesson in shamelessness. Picture the scene, a bustling marketplace in Athens, filled with merchants, families, and philosophers. And there's Diogenes, openly pleasuring himself. People were shocked, disgusted even, but when confronted he calmly said, "I wish it were as easy to satisfy hunger by rubbing my stomach." Now let's stop and think. What was Diogenes trying to say here? He wasn't just being outrageous for the sake of it. He wanted to challenge the norms of society, especially the arbitrary shame we attach to certain natural acts. Diogenes believed that many of the things we're embarrassed about are simply part of our human nature. In his eyes, the shame people felt was not about the act itself, but about society's conditioning. He was teaching people to question why we're embarrassed about things that are part of who we are. Now let's compare this to today's world. How often do we feel ashamed for things that are entirely natural? Maybe you felt embarrassed about your body, your emotions, or even your failures because society tells you these things aren't acceptable. But is that shame real, or is it just something you've been taught to feel? We live in a world where people constantly hide behind filters on social media, presenting a version of themselves that is far from reality. Diogenes would tell us to strip away the filters, both literally and metaphorically, and embrace who we truly are. Answer this simple question in comments. How much of your life is driven by a fear of judgment? What would change if you stopped caring about what others think and embraced your true nature? Diogenes' lesson here is simple. Don't let artificial shame dictate your life. Be proud of your natural self. After all, most of the shame we feel isn't real. It's been programmed into us by society. Incident number 2. The dog-like behavior, embracing our animal instincts. Let's dive into why Diogenes was called Diogenes the dog. No, it wasn't just an insult. Diogenes embraced the comparison. On multiple occasions, he acted like a dog, urinating in public, defecating openly, and even eating raw meat. When asked why he did this, he replied, "I act like a dog because a dog lives according to nature." He believed dogs were the perfect model for living authentically. Dogs don't care about what society thinks. They don't worry about wealth, power, or appearances. They simply live, eating when they're hungry, sleeping when they're tired, and showing loyalty and honesty. Diogenes admired that. He wanted to strip away the unnecessary layers that society forces on us and return to a life that was pure and in harmony with nature. Now think about your own life today. We constantly complicate things, don't we? We stress over how we look, what people think of us, and whether we're meeting society's expectations. We buy things we don't need to impress people we don't know. Diogenes would call this nonsense. He would say, "Why are you chasing after wealth and status when you could be happy just being yourself?" We're often so consumed by our desires for more money, more possessions, more status, that we forget to enjoy the simple things in life. How much of your life do you spend worrying about things that ultimately don't matter? What if you could live more like a dog, free from the pressures of society and focused on what truly matters? Answer in comments what's your opinion. Diogenes teaches us to embrace simplicity. The more we let go of unnecessary worries, the more peace we can find. Life doesn't need to be as complicated as we make it. Incident number 3. The encounter with Alexander the Great, the ultimate test of contentment. One of the most famous stories about Diogenes involves his meeting with Alexander the Great. Alexander, the most powerful man in the world, sought out Diogenes because he was intrigued by the philosopher's radical lifestyle. When Alexander found Diogenes relaxing in the sun, he asked, "Is there anything I can do for you?" Diogenes, without even looking at him, said, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." Now think about that for a moment. Alexander, who could have given Diogenes anything, riches, power, land, was dismissed like he didn't matter. Why? Because Diogenes was content with what he had. He didn't need or want anything more. He had mastered the art of contentment, something many of us struggle with. Let's bring this to today's context. How often do we think, if I just had more money, a better job, or a bigger house, then I'd be happy? We chase after things, always thinking the next big achievement will bring us contentment. But Diogenes teaches us that contentment doesn't come from external things. It comes from within. He had nothing by today's standards. He lived in a barrel, owned almost nothing, and yet he was probably one of the happiest people of his time. Again, question for you. What do you think will make you truly happy? And are you sure it's something external? Or is it possible that real happiness comes from accepting and being content with what you already have? Diogenes' encounter with Alexander the Great shows us that contentment doesn't come from what you have, but from appreciating what you don't need. Stop chasing things you think will make you happy and start finding contentment where you are right now. Incident number 4, the lantern in the daytime, the search for honest men. Next, let's talk about Diogenes' famous act of wandering around Athens during the day, carrying a lantern. When people asked him why he was doing this, he said, "I'm looking for an honest man." The punchline? He never found one. At first, this seems like a joke, but it's deeper than that. Diogenes was making a point about human dishonesty, not just lying to others, but lying to ourselves. He believed that most people were dishonest about their ambitions, desires, and even their happiness. They wore masks to fit into society, presenting themselves as something they were not. Now, let's think about modern life. How many of us are truly honest, both with others and with ourselves? Look at social media. We create these perfect versions of ourselves online, showing only the best parts of our lives. But behind those carefully curated posts, many people feel insecure, anxious, or even unhappy. Diogenes' lantern search is relevant now more than ever. We often lie to ourselves, convincing ourselves that the life we portray is the one we're truly living. But is it? Are you living authentically, or are you living a version of your life designed to impress others? What would happen if you took off the mask and embraced your true self? Diogenes challenges us to be honest, not just with the world but with ourselves. True happiness comes from living authentically, without pretending to be something we're not. Incident number 5. Living in a barrel, rejecting materialism, and embracing simplicity. Perhaps the most iconic image of Diogenes is him living in a large ceramic jar, or what we commonly call a barrel. He had no possessions except a cloak, a staff, and a small cup for drinking water. But one day, he saw a young boy drinking water with his hands, and Diogenes immediately threw away his cup, saying, "If a child can drink with his hands, why do I need this cup?" Diogenes lived this way to reject materialism. He wanted to show that true happiness comes from needing less, not having more. He believed that society's obsession with wealth and possessions only complicates life and distracts us from what really matters, virtue and wisdom. Let's compare this to our lives today. We live in a world that constantly tells us we need more to be happy. New clothes, new cars, new gadgets. There's always something more to buy. But does all of that really make us happy? Diogenes would argue that it doesn't. The more we own, the more we're owned by our possessions. True freedom, according to Diogenes, comes from wanting less. Last question for you. What possessions in your life could you live without? And how would it feel to let go of the things that don't actually bring you happiness? Diogenes teaches us that simplicity leads to freedom. The less you need, the freer you become. Are you ready to simplify your life and focus on what truly matters? Here's the conclusion. Diogenes lived a life that challenged every norm and expectation of his time, but his message is just as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago. His radical acts weren't just about being controversial. They were about exposing the absurdities of society and reminding us to live authentically, simply, and without shame. So, what can you take from Diogenes? Can you embrace simplicity and contentment? Can you live more authentically, without worrying about what others think? If Diogenes were here today, he'd probably tell you to strip away the unnecessary parts of your life and focus on what really matters: virtue, wisdom, and honesty. If you found value in this video, hit the subscribe button and join our Virtue Code community, where we explore more lessons from ancient philosophers to help you live a better life. And here's your challenge for today. Ask yourself, what's one thing I can let go of that's complicating my life? Let me know in the comments below.